Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this live webinar on Mozambique's debt crisis and Africa Research Institute. We're hosting live via YouTube with a live chat function where you can put questions to the panel if you have a YouTube account. Africa Research Institute at nick@africaresearch.org. And his email address hopefully is appearing on your screens now. I'm Tom Bowker, editor of Zitamar News, and I'll be joined today by a panel of 4 experts who can share their different perspectives on what we're calling a debt crisis, and I think that's fair. Points over the last year or so, including just last week when Mozambique defaulted on the very first payment on its very first sovereign Eurobond. Today we'll be asking, how did Mozambique get into the mess that it's in, and how might it get out of it? But first, a brief recap of that mess. In 2013, Mozambique's secret services struck a deal, or perhaps a series of deals, to buy a maritime security package with some tuna fishing boats thrown in from Lebanese shipbuilding group Invest. Though an initial $372 million was quoted, the deal grew to $2 billion as those involved realized they could raise seemingly endless amounts of money on international capital markets and syndicated loan markets, as long as those loans had sovereign guarantees. Borrowed by 3 state-owned companies in loans arranged by Credit Suisse and Russian bank VTB Capital. 2 were kept secret, but one, Hamoodi, sold $850 million in bond notes on the capital markets in September 2013, ostensibly to fund a tuna fishing fleet. A year, however, Mozambique's government had admitted that the majority of that money was spent on defense. When repayments on that bond started coming due, Mozambique found itself unable to pay. Projects and falling commodity prices, as well as Hamoodi's failure to generate any significant revenue, let alone profit, meant the government's coffers were empty, and in March 2016 it had to restructure the Hamoodi bond into a sovereign bond to be repaid only in 2023. That process that one of the 2 secret loans, $622 million for Pro-Indicus, was uncovered, leading the IMF to suspend its program with Mozambique to withdraw budget support. A chastened Mozambique government was soon forced to admit there was a 3rd loan, $5 million for Mozambique Asset Management, or MAM. Since then, the situation has deteriorated even further, with the government admitting in October last year that it had no money to make payments on any of the 3 loans, even the sovereign bond it had sold to investors just 7 months earlier. A parliamentary commission in October 2016 found what many had long suspected, that the sovereign guarantees were granted in contravention of Mozambican law. An independent audit is being undertaken of the 3 deals by investigations firm Kroll, and the holders of Mozambique's sovereign bond are refusing to negotiate a restructure until that investigation is made public and until there is a new IMF program in place. On the 18th of January, Mozambique missed the first coupon payment on the bond of $60 million, and as things stand, will be unable. The next one. Okay, that was a longish introduction, but trying to cut a very long story to a reasonable length. To start, I want to also introduce the panel that's joining me today. We have Anne Frühauf, who leads Teneo Intelligence's political risk research on Southern Africa, with a particular focus on South Africa and Mozambique. She advises corporate financial sector clients on political and policy change, including a number of investors in Mozambique's sovereign bond. Dr. Roberto Tibana has more than 30 years' experience as an economist, of which the last 18 have been in macroeconomic and public finance management in sub-Saharan African countries, while working for the World Bank, IMF, OECD, UNDP, bilateral donor governments, and other agencies. Now based in Maputo, Roberto is also a political activist, a campaign to broaden participation in Mozambique's peace process. Dr. Joseph Hanlon is a visiting senior fellow at the LSE and correspondent for The Guardian and the BBC in Mozambique during the 1980s. He was a policy advisor on the Jubilee 2000 campaign to cancel developing country debt, and has written 7 books on Mozambique, as well as being a respected authority on the concept of odious debt. Finally, Tariq Hamoodi is a partner at Bybrook Capital in London, an active investor in distressed and frontier sovereign credit markets. Well, I think that sounds like Mozambique. He started his career at Morgan Stanley in 2011, where he traded emerging markets credit before joining Bybrook. Just to outline the discussion, I've given a short background to the crisis, but I'm going to turn that to the panel now. Then we'll ask what impact the crisis has had on Mozambique's domestic economy and politics. How might the restructure talks play out? Can there be a solution that's acceptable to all parties? And finally, the question of whether Mozambique should refuse to honour the sovereign guarantees it made on the 3 loans. So first, I'm going to turn to Anne, just thinking back to how this scandal played out. When was the first time you heard about it and about the Amatum bonds? And what was the first time when you realised there was something fishy going on, to use the cliche that all journalists love when writing about this story?
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much, Tom. The first company I actually heard about was not Amatum, it was Proindicus, round about 2012. And at the time, I heard that the government was trying to raise money for a maritime security project worth around $500 million. I heard that there was some talk with a DBSA, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, which seemed to go nowhere. So it was never clear whether the project was going to get off the ground. Then fast forward to September 2013, the Amatum debt was placed. And it was really the first anyone had heard of it, including the IMF, which was very taken aback by this project. From the very start, Amatum seemed a fishy project, as you say. The entity barely seemed to exist when the money was raised. It was hastily assembled. It had no office. It had no operations. And the viability of it, from the very start, seemed to be in doubt because quite frankly, the sort of tuna revenue projected was always questionable from the start. So it became clear pretty quickly that this was primarily an arms deal dressed up as a tuna fishing enterprise, and in a way, the government admitted this quite quickly when it assumed direct responsibility of 500 million of the 850 million debt as defense expenditure. I think this was just a year later. So I think from the very start there were a million questions about this deal. I think the only difference back then was that after the initial shock, the IMF was willing to give Mozambique the benefit of the doubt. It had been a decent pupil of the IMF for more than a decade, and even though it was hardly the sort of public investment priority that you would want to promote, the IMF initially was willing to consider the rationale for both sort of some maritime security expenditure and also the a local tuna fishing outfit. Investors at the time loved the debt because it was the only way to get exposure to a really hot market at the time, right? So it was very heady times for all involved. And then really things started to deteriorate when in 2015, when rumors started to circulate of additional debt, which the government initially denied, and which, as you mentioned in your introduction, was then confirmed in 2016. So then it became clear that Amatum hadn't been a kind of isolated accident that could potentially be justified after the fact and potentially be made viable. It had, in fact, what we had was a total debt free-for-all, driven by very big political needs, right, around the 2014 elections and a presidential succession, and driven by very, very big economic expectations, which effectively kind of brought the government to mortgage Mozambique's supposed windfall revenue way before it had materialized.
Okay, before we get too deep into the investors at that point were excited about being able to get exposure to Mozambique. I want to bring in Tariq Hamoodi here. How did you become aware of your initial impression of what was being offered to the market?
Hello.
Hello.
Sorry, could you repeat that, Tom?
Yeah, I don't know if you could tell us what was your when did you first come into contact with the Amatum bond issue, and what was your being offered, or what was on them?
Well, when they came to the market, they came with a flurry of other sub-Saharan sovereign issuers, right? So I think it is, the market had obviously flourished in the late 2000s, up until a couple of years ago, and as Anne said, it was obviously a market that many sovereign debt investors wanted exposure to, in light of the commodity boom. And I think Mozambique was obviously in Martin's bond. I think investors wrongly looked at it as a way to gain Mozambique sovereign exposure to one of the SOEs, and bought into the idea that that they were obviously at a firm and an iron-tight guarantee.
Okay, I'm happy hearing you. I don't know about everyone else. But perhaps it would help if the other participants put their microphones on mute until you're actually speaking. Tariq, you were saying it was it came in the context of a very African, and it was an opportunity to gain access to the country in the capital markets. Then is it right?
Yeah, I mean, look, typically I think people were quite taken back on the actual issuers coming to market rather than being a sovereign issuer or being directly issued by the Ministry of Finance itself. But look, I think you typically have real money investors, for example, who would have made up the large portion of guys who originally owned this bond. Who, look, I think by being constrained by probably time and resources, took it for what it was worth as a sovereign bond with a watertight guarantee. I think investors themselves, as probably Fitch would noted, probably hadn't done their work on what on the entity that was actually issuing the bonds. And they look for reasons of, I'm sure, disclosure. It was probably tough to see what the Amatum entity or what the project actually was. But so I think that probably is what caught people off the entire deal.
Do you think also that investors in the Amatum bond would have felt led? There had also been Pro-Indicus and MAM. Mozambique had been borrowing with sovereign guarantees at the same time.
Well, there's no question that other investors in the emerging market debt space would have known about those Pro-Indicus and MAM deals, because obviously Credit Suisse and VTB had syndicated out a lot of the risk. As a matter of fact, there's actually quite a bit of cross-holding between the loans and the bonds. It's just probably the fact of the matter is that most bond players typically wouldn't see those types of offers in the market when it comes to loans. They would probably be at a very targeted group of investors. But that's not to say, I mean, look, those loans were obviously sold to some of the Portuguese banks, for example, which hold quite a bit, and quite a few more mainstream emerging market debt investors as well. So look, obviously disclosure was an issue, and the actual the banks that led the deal would obviously say, well, look, they were in the prospectus, they were disclosed. Whereas other investors would probably say, yeah, well, they weren't clear on the roadshow that these existed, but of course they were noted in the bond documents.
Okay. So the issue.
Hello, Tom. I've lost you.
The banks did. Can I bring you in here, Roberto?
Yes. Okay.
Can you
hear you now?
Can you hear me okay now? Let's ask your perspective from as a Mozambican and within Mozambique. What was the shock like when people found out about these deals? First Ematum, and then a couple of years later found out about MAM and Pro Indicus, and what that's meant in terms of the political environment in Mozambique.
Well, I mean, it was a big shock. In the typical Mozambican way, where things are accommodated, you know, once the IMF got in and worked with the government how to deal with that in terms of incorporating those numbers in the budget, and then once the parliament had accommodated that, things quite calmed down, and people sort of said, okay, let's service this, and there was a lot of explanation given about why was that contracted and so on. But the Pro Indicus and the MAM story was a completely different story, and it took people back to Ematum, and people started asking whether what they had heard about Ematum was the true story, and this is the question that still people are asking. So that was quite a shock.
Okay, so
yeah.
No, carry on. So there's still a level of shock about, and still questions being asked in Mozambique as to whether we know the full story yet.
I didn't hear that last bit, but yes, still questions are being asked. Where has this money gone? What has it has it done? And even now, when we are having all these big rains and roads are being cut here and there, people are looking at these roads and say, but come on, wait a minute. We were told that most of these loans were for infrastructure coming back from the previous ones because there was a buildup of debt. Even before the Ematum and MAM, people were beginning to ask, and the explanation was it's about infrastructure, and these later ones came, it was about defense, it was about sovereignty. Are there, we don't seem to see the things having improved on the ground. So from shock to asking questions, it's where we are now. And people saying, hang on, before we really accommodate this into our pockets, we need to know what is happening.
Joe Hanlon, do you want to come in on that one as well?
Tom, before we do, just a reminder that I can't see Zencastr working at my end.
Oh, that's a shame. Okay, I will stop sharing this screen for a second. Good point.
Okay, it looks like it's working. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, so I think that means the recording will start from here. So perhaps I'll give a brief introduction again. You're listening to a live webinar presented by Zitamar News and Africa Research Institute on the Mozambique debt crisis. I'm going to move on to the second question here, discussing the impact that the crisis had on Mozambique's domestic economy and politics. Joseph Hanlon, you're a seasoned observer of Mozambique's political situation. Can you give us an idea of the importance of this scandal in the context of Mozambique's political settlement?
Well, I think it's important both politically and economically, because politically it's such a huge amount of money. I mean, we're dealing with $2 billion in secret lending. By Mozambican standards, an astronomical amount of money. And I think that triggered, of course, and has continued to trigger a political problem, because effectively $2 billion has been borrowed without permission, without any of the procedures being followed. But of course, that triggered an economic crisis. And the economic crisis has proved to be very serious because the IMF cut off its loan, the donors cut off budget support. That in turn has created a really desperate foreign exchange crisis, which has led to 100% devaluation. Now, the currency was always overvalued, so we've actually ended up with the Mozambican Metical at about the right rate of exchange against the rand and against the dollar, because the Gubuza administration had been keeping the Metical overvalued in order to allow poor people to import from South Africa. But I think just the mess that has been created and the total crisis in the economy, because interest rates have now gone up, inflation has been very high. There's basically no money and no capital in the economy. It's not clear what's going to happen until there is a settlement. And I think any kind of settlement is going to be at least 6 months off. So this crisis is going to continue.
Okay, well, let's take a look now at the question of the debt restructure. So Mozambique announced in October last year that it left to pay these loans back. And so it's asking the holders of the 3 loan packages, Pro-Indicus, MAM, and now, which used to be Ematum, to restructure between the bondholders are holding out for an investigation by Kroll to be completed. But perhaps I'll go to Anne Frühauf of Teneo Intelligence again first. And what do you think the different parties are hoping for here? Let's maybe start with the government and its advisors, Lazard and White and Case. What's their plan A, do you think?
Yeah, well, first of all, Tom, I think it's going to be an extremely tough negotiation process. I think the government and its advisors need to secure a deal that really postpones the bulk of the debt repayments, like it did with the sovereign bond, well into the 2020s. Again, on the premise that LNG revenue will start flowing by around that time, right? So it's going to be a very difficult, it's going to be a very, very tough negotiation, convincing creditors who've, been told for the longest time that there was this big windfall payment around the corner, that this is really materializing, given that there've been all these delays around this, right? So I think the government is in a very, very tough position. We have seen that their repayment capacity over the medium term up until at least 2020 is close to non-existent. It's out of the question that MAM and Pro-Indicus can be repaid at the current rates, right? So we are talking about a very significant restructuring deal that we need to reach. It's increasingly difficult for me to envisage how that can avoid a haircut for the creditors. And of course, the difficulty from the bondholders' perspective, and which I'm sure Tariq will talk about as well, is that bondholders have already participated in one reprofiling of the debt. They are saying, well, why should we be put in the same boat as the creditors of the clearly illegal Pro-Indicus and MAM debt?
I mean, there's no distinction to be made between the legality of Ematum, Pro-Indicus, and MAM, but I suppose it's because Ematum was replaced with a sovereign bond, which was sold in a more perhaps above board way, that the bondholders there are asking for different treatment. Tariq, you at least have been a bondholder. Can you sympathise with the bondholders who think that they should be treated differently, having already been through a restructure?
Well, I think you have to consider that obviously some bondholders would have felt that they've already been through a restructuring, whereas when the Ematum restructuring took place into a sovereign bond, it was done at NPV neutral or NPV positive terms. So although there probably was some cash flow relief in regards to the amortization schedule of the bond, In reality, obviously, they were restructured into an instrument with a higher coupon, would argue that they've gone up the capital structure, etc. So I think different treatment is obviously it's tough to see. Look, obviously the advisors have been forthcoming that the guarantees are legally binding. I think there'll be some will from the bondholders to try and call odious debt on the guarantees. Now, obviously, that needs to be called by the government itself, who would then, it'd be an admission of guilt on their part, and who knows what international criminal action would be subject to on the back of that. So it's hard to see Frelimo doing that. I also think if you consider that the guarantees and at least the advisors have been forthcoming that they're all binding. The tough argument here is that actually the MAM and Prondicus loan are actually owed more upfront on NPV terms, with given there's some big payments due. So I think in the end, obviously there'll be the advisors' intentions to restructure all three of the loans and bonds into one bond or one particular instrument. But that would be one base case.
Okay, so you think most likely that all three facilities will be bundled together into a loan that might resemble.
Exactly. I think it's hard to see anything otherwise. I think that the hopes of differential treatment and particularly more favorable treatment to the bonds isn't realistic. I think obviously the only claim that the bondholders would really have would be an odious debt claim, which is a very long route through the courts, through UK courts. I think it's hard to see a case other than usually state succession or government secession where that could take place. Look, if you wanted to envision a scenario where the bondholders actually held out for the government to change, or for Renamo to suddenly have take power and to call those debts odious, then that would be a very, very obviously long and complicated route, and you'd really just be chancing it that type of government secession could happen.
Okay, let's bring in Joe Hanlon here, who I think is keen to talk about whether there's a case for odious debt. Agree with Tariq that it can't really be called odious debt unless there's a change in government?
Yes, and I think that's the reason that one tends to use the term illegitimate debt, which is a broader categorization. But I want to step back slightly and say that there is an argument against bundling the three loans, because the three loans are structured in different ways. Ematum was originally a Eurobond issue, which has been replaced by a sovereign bond. MAM and Pro Indicus are syndicated loans. And that means they have a different structure. Now, if we ignore Ematum for a moment and come back to Ematum later, we just look at MAM and Pro Indicus. What I'm seeing here in London as I talk to people in the bond industry and so on, is that there's huge criticism of Credit Suisse and VTB, because it is argued that they made the loan illegitimate by not either doing a due diligence or by ignoring the due diligence. Because any due diligence on this loan would have shown three things. First, it would have shown that the guarantee was unconstitutional and illegal, which is what the Parliamentary Commission has also found. Second, it would have shown that the feasibility studies were totally ridiculous. I mean, assuming that Mozambique would get 5 times as much of its tuna as the Seychelles, for instance, or assuming the fees that could be charged for shipping going through the channel. So that was ridiculous. And the third thing, which is much more important, is that the package of the 3 loans pushes Mozambique into debt unsustainability. Now, that means that they were selling loans which they should have known could not be repaid because Mozambique's total loan package was unsustainable. So what happens then is that Credit Suisse and VTB were saying to the people who were taking on parts of those loans that this was a repayable loan when it manifestly was not. So that the claim is largely against Credit Suisse and VTB and not against the Mozambican government. So what the Mozambican government simply needs to do is to say that they do not honor and do not acknowledge the loan guarantee. That would then have to go to arbitration in court in Britain, but the point would be that Mozambique would simply say, these are loans to private companies, they have nothing to do with us, you have to collect off the private companies. Manuel Chang had no right to make the guarantee, he was acting ultra vires, that would probably be accepted by a London court. Now, Ematum is slightly more complicated, and it's interesting that the bondholders are looking at 2 different things here. Because this is now a sovereign bond that Mozambique government has issued, it has accepted liability for that debt. On the other hand, the original bonds, which were sold by Credit Suisse and VTB, were sold on the same false prospectus. So they do have a claim against Credit Suisse and VTB that those banks led them astray. So all of the borrowers, whether they're bondholders or taking pieces of the MAM and Pro Indicus loan, have a case against Credit Suisse and VTB for misleading them. There is no chance that these loans could ever have been repaid, and it is obvious, it would have been obvious from any due diligence. So if Credit Suisse did a due diligence, he ignored it. So there is obviously a case against Credit Suisse. So Mozambique should treat these 3 loans differently. They should say, we simply do not acknowledge the guarantee, which could not be made, was manifestly illegal. Any due diligence would have shown it was illegal. And then they do need to renegotiate, I think, the Ematum bonds, because these are sovereign bonds. So I think that the packages needed to be treated differently. But the importance of this is if Mozambique simply says they do not accept the $1.2 billion for MAM and Pro Indicus, that brings them much closer to debt sustainability. That then allows a serious opening of negotiations with the IMF. Now, the final point in all of this is both the donors and I believe the IMF are saying privately they do not want their aid money to be used to pay off these debts. So I think for Mozambique to refuse to accept the guarantee on MAM and Pro Indicus would almost surely be accepted by the donor community and by the IMF. And this would make it very difficult because Credit Suisse, in turn, does not want to go into open court to admit that they ignored their own due diligence and that they misled their own borrowers. So I think that for Mozambique, they want to treat the MAM and Pro Indicus debt separately and simply say they do not acknowledge the guarantee.
And I just heard a big echo on the line. think definitely the guarantee. Tariq's highlighted that the government's advisors are obviously saying they are valid. Joe is saying that they're manifestly rule on this.
Tom, sorry, was that question directed at me?
Yes, it was. Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, I only got part of your question. I think the biggest problem I see here is political, right? Because the government hasn't made much a move in that direction. They might have a very good case. They might have a very good case to, as Joe highlighted, to try and refuse to accept liability for loans that were really granted relatively recklessly, you could argue. So the question is political, I think. The government has taken, I think the bare minimum steps to try and investigate the deals, but I haven't seen any sign that they are trying to make the case for odious debt or for illegitimate debt. And I think it's because that would involve opening themselves up to much greater investigations and potential liabilities and accountability around, who was really responsible for not just signing the guarantees, but who are the broader beneficiaries. And I think this is something that I think, the Frelimo government has been very keen to avoid. So the question for me is, will they accept a very heavy debt burden, primarily because of the political dynamics at play in the former administration of Gabuza and under Nyusi now.
Okay, Roberto, Tibana, what do you see happening on the political scene here? Do you think there'll be any repercussions for the politicians and others involved in taking out these loans on the government, on the state's account?
Well, let me step back and take on Joe's argument, which sounds good argument, sounds solid, but it has a difficulty, and it's related to the question that you are asking me now. Mm-hmm. The premise, Joe's premise, is that there will be a deal to sacrifice Manel Shank, the minister who signed the guarantees, and that would be what the government would offer to the creditors and to the IMF and to the donors, and say, we have taken our measures, we have gotten hold of our rogue man, but we don't recognize this is in jail, and we don't recognize what he did. That's what, from what I understood. The difficulty with that is, as Anne said, this is going to be a process. This is going to be a court process. Is going to have to answer questions, and there is the issue of, at the end of the day, from these monies, and that's going to open another big can of worms, and I'm not sure whether they will be ready, even on the assumption that they will just offer as the sacrifice lamb. I will end there. So that is going to be a route that is probably going to go. I think the issue of treatment of these debts, it's crucial, because as Anne said, I would think that creditors will have to take a haircut here. The current holders of these credits and bonds would say, okay, we bought this from VTB and Credit Suisse, but they should have known. They should have done their due diligence as well, as they were going to buy this stuff from sellers. And the primary issuers then have even a much bigger responsibility due to failure of their due diligence. And there is a question as to whether it was pure mistake. I mean, we're dealing with big banks here, dealing with people who do this stuff every single day. I mean, how do you come to a country like the poorest country in the world, and you just take up these loans and to ask questions, whether these people can pay, whether these people have been authorized to sign these papers or not. So they will have to take a haircut. And I think the issue of treatment, of differential treatment, is probably out of question, particularly if you want to negotiate a haircut on this. So politically, it's going to be serious because some of the people in government right now, starting from the president, they were members of the that issued all this thing. And remember that the current president was the Minister of Defense and some portfolio. So it's going to be very hard for any of them to say, well, we didn't know about this and wash hands on and offer shank, because they were part of the government and they were not junior ministers, they were senior ministers. So I can't see how that route can work. And I think it's going to be a serious, this may drag down into, 2019, into the next election cycle, which is next year. I hear talk about Kroll having difficulties to move with this, probably having to ask an extension for these investigations. Probably it's going to be convenient for the government. Probably it's going to be convenient for the authorities for this to drag for another 6 months and so on. Remember, there is a political agenda in this country. This year is the year when Frelimo has slated its Congress for September. And this is going to be a decisive Congress. That's where they are going to decide whether this president is going to be their standard bearer for the next elections, or they said, this man doesn't work for us, and so they are going to opt for another man. How is the government going to deal with war situation that it's still not completely resolved, that are still being investigated? We're not even at the point exactly what happened and how it happened and where the monies are and so on, and then having to make a decision on a man who was part of all this process, both the war and the debts, and yet who has shown a performance that doesn't really look like a performance of a country like Mozambique, or president of a country like Mozambique. So it's going to be serious stuff politically, and I think it's open for another probably 12, 18 months.
Are you saying that potentially Frelimo could ditch President Nyusi at the next elections in order to be able to make more of a case about illegitimate debt and to repudiate these guarantees?
Could be. I'm not saying exactly it's going to happen, but it could be. I don't know what the options are there, but it could turn around that. It could turn around that. Not only it could turn around ditching him or not, ditching him out or not only because of these debts, but also because of the other developments. Being able to deliver peace.
Joe, can you imagine that happening?
I think
choosing a second term.
I think it's clear that this debt is going to have an impact on the elections, and I think Frelimo hasn't appreciated just how great the anger is out in the country. But I think that one should back up a little bit and say, what would the legal process look like in London? And that will influence what Mozambique has to do itself. Now, the Kroll report, whatever they have trouble or not, will reveal a great deal about liabilities, responsibilities, some estimates of how much has been stolen. But the point is that if Mozambique refuses to honor the guarantees, at least on the MAM and the Pro-Indicus debt, it would be likely to go to a trial or arbitration in London. Now, if it goes to a trial, Credit Suisse would be forced to present their due diligence reports that there would be an attempt in public to compare what Credit Suisse told its borrowers with what it knew. If it went to arbitration, all of that is kept secret. Now, what that would probably benefit both parties, because Mozambique could then go into this with any discussion of who stole the money, because it would be secret, and Credit Suisse would not have to show how much it had cheated its creditors, its borrowers. So the likelihood that this, if Mozambique refused to honor the guarantees, that this would lead to a closed arbitration process in London might suit all parties. And therefore, they would not be under nearly the pressure to prosecute people in Mozambique. And so I think that would be the way both sides would get around it. Because I think one should realize, at least the noise here in London, is that people are really quite angry at Credit Suisse over this. Because they feel that Credit Suisse, talking privately to people in the industry, they are saying Credit Suisse totally misled its borrowers, totally misled the people who were taking the bonds, and that they were dependent on the due diligence of Credit Suisse. So Credit Suisse is already in trouble for a whole string of other things, is not going to want its documentation to be out in public. So it will want to go for arbitration. Mozambique will want to go for arbitration so they don't wash their dirty linen in public. When both sides don't have clean hands, you're much better off with secret arbitration. And I think that's the way it would go.
Could Credit Suisse keep things from its shareholders in terms of how much it was being asked of compensation?
It could keep all the documentation from its shareholders. It would have to, there would be a settlement in the end, and that would be public. So they would have to say, okay, we have been forced to accept part of the liability for this. But the documentation, which would show their misconduct, would remain secret.
Okay, I'm gonna, in a moment, gonna go to Nick Branson from Africa Research Institute to see if he's got any questions submitted. Just a reminder, if you're just joining us, you're listening to a live webinar on the 25th of January, or perhaps you're listening to a recording of the webinar on Mozambique's debt crisis, brought to you by Zitamar News and Africa Research Institute. I'm Tom Bowker, editor of Zitamar News, and I'm joined by a four-strong panel. Senior Vice President with Teneo Intelligence, Dr. Roberto Tibana, Principal Consultant at Analitica-RJT in Maputo, Mozambique, Dr. Joseph Hanlon, Visiting Senior Fellow at the London School of Economics, and Tariq Hamoodi, Partner at Bybrook Capital in London. I can see in the chat here on YouTube that there are some questions about Kroll's audit, which is currently being undertaken, and when it's due. It's due at the end of February, as Tim Jones here has answered. Certainly asked for a 3-month extension, which could take us to May. Now, Joe, you've also said, I think, that they'll probably look for a 3-month extension, but that'll also mean a delay in getting the IMF program back in place, which could delay all sorts of things, including a final investment decision on the gas projects. Do you think there's going to be an extension there, Joe, or is that putting things back too far?
When I was last in Maputo and talking to people about that, everybody expected a 3-month extension. I mean, one of the problems is that all of the money on these loans appears to have gone directly to Privinvest in Abu Dhabi and not gone to the 3 private companies in Mozambique, which is very unusual. That's also part of the due diligence issue, because Credit Suisse, you would have thought, would have done a due diligence on Privinvest, which would raise some questions. But the point is then that the documentation on what the money was used for is held by Privinvest, and they are unlikely to cooperate with Kroll. So it means unpacking what documentation the 3 private companies themselves have. I think that is likely to be much more complicated and would require the cooperation of the security services in Mozambique, which own those 3 companies. And I think that, at least even with the best of cooperation, will take more time, because you're trying to unpick from secondary sources what this money is being used for. And we know some of the money is being used to pay commissions, and some of it's all quite vague. So trying to pin together what the money was used for, I think, is not straightforward. So yes, I think there will be another extension. yes, I think it will therefore be late in the year before there's any settlement with the IMF.
Question from the chat here is if anyone knows what. Sorry, Nick, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, it's a related point here with the discussion and also the question coming from Tim Jones on the live chat. Really, just about whether these the sort of the international investigators are going to have any luck here. As Joe was just saying, a lot of the documentation's held outside of Mozambique, but Glenn Flint has asked whether SEC officials are undertaking inquiries in Mozambique and outside regarding this investigation, and equally whether any of this documentation will come out. And similarly, Tim Jones has asked whether the Financial Conduct Authority is going to have access to the same information.
I think
Thanks,
that.
Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, we know the SEC is doing investigation. They have asked for copies of all the documents that were provided to the Ematum bond purchasers in the first instance. So they will want to compare that to what we know about the loans actually. And so that will link to the feasibility studies and some of the others. We don't know what the Financial Conduct Authority here in London is doing. It doesn't seem to be a high priority for them. It's also not an area.
Tariq has an idea. Tariq, have you been contacted by the FCA? Are you able to tell us if you know if there's an ongoing investigation?
No, some of the bondholders have actually took solace in the fact that there has been the SEC investigation that is launched, and I think they're hoping that they'll use that as their other arguments on pursuing the illegitimate or odious debt rule, irrespective of whether the government wants to. But we've heard next to nothing. I think obviously some of the holders of the loan pursued both or initiated proceedings against Credit Suisse and BPB in London courts. I don't know how far that's gone or where that stands at the moment.
So there have been cases brought in London courts already about this.
So I'm told. I mean, that they at least initiated proceedings.
Okay, I didn't know that. Anne, have you heard anything about cases already being brought?
None of the details. I know that there are some actions underway, but as I said, I don't have the details. I think the key question would be, how do all the investigations that are underway, how do they come together, and do they reveal anything meaningful? I agree with Joe that it'll be very difficult to get to the bottom and trace the money to its endpoints, because especially because of the role of Privinvest that has received all the money. So I think this, to really get to the bottom of the truth here, it will be quite a challenge.
Okay. Perhaps on that note, and I see we're coming up to an hour, it would be the right time to start bringing things to a close. Nick, do you have any more questions?
Yeah, I have one from a Mozambican journalist who I'll paste it into the box now. He's wondering, or she potentially is wondering, really where who individually or which groups masterminded this. And this is a very contentious issue, obviously. But is it clear to any of the panelists whether there was a lead on this, be it during, within the last government, or whether there is someone from the financial community or in Privinvest who was driving this whole process, or were they all culpable to different degrees? I've copied it in there so you can have a read.
Okay, there's an invitation to point the finger. Who wants to have a go?
Well, I think from what what I've heard is that, and I know much has been made about the Credit Suisse banker who was working with Privinvest and in Iskander Safi on this particular deal, right? And it looks like they organized it also in an advisory capability. It looks like out of a Swiss company, which it looks like it's recently been wound up or closed. So there's no question that that I believe the gentleman's name is
Iskander Safa.
Yes, Iskander Safa, but the Credit Suisse banker is Andrew. You'll know. I think quite public. Andrew Mears. Pierce, that's it. Yes, Pierce. Yeah, so that I mean, the interesting thing though is when you speak to even some of the advisors are sort of aren't aware of the depths of this, and they don't really not aware that there was a Swiss company involved in organizing the loans, or that these particular bankers were involved.
Right. Yeah. From the Parliamentary Inquiry Commission here in Mozambique, which only interviewed Mozambicans, from the testimony of the secret services, it seemed like they had gone out with not a public tender, but a broad tender to a number of companies before they actually chose Privinvest. So it's really difficult to unpick where this story, like Privinvest and Credit Suisse entered the scene at around the same time, if not together. Anne, perhaps what's your view on that?
I think it's very likely. I'd like to say that I think at the Mozambican end, I am personally not convinced that Manuel Chang was the sort of rogue mastermind that authored this whole debacle. I've heard from many sources that he was pushed to sign the guarantees, and so I really think that certainly at the Mozambican end, you have to cast the net a lot wider.
Yeah. Roberto, before we go.
Yeah, I will end by going back to the earlier discussion about, since now the government has put forward proposal for, renegotiating all this stuff, restructuring it. The big hurdle, I think, will be for them to really be called for a haircut. I think the big question is going to be for them to prove what is the limit of the paying capacity. And that has to do with the kind of adjustment they are ready to make internally. And I think that's creating another difficulty in all this process, because it doesn't seem from what they did with the revised budget mid last year and the new budget, it doesn't seem that they're making enough adjustment to ensure and to assure the holders of this debt that really this government doesn't have enough capacity to pay. They've made all the sacrifices that they need to make, and they can't pay. The second thing that has to do with is the role of the IMF. Editors are calling for is for the IMF to come and help to design a program, look at the numbers, design a program, certify these accounts. We can certify these numbers from the fiscal perspective, and we can say that we have seen, we can understand that this government cannot go beyond this. It doesn't have. So I think the assurance that the holders are wanting to have is partly, knowing more of the stuff through the results of the audit, but also by asking the IMF to move first is to make sure that they're not being cheated, that again, the IMF has come and they have certified this. Now, here again is the credibility of the fund, because all this happened under the watch of the fund. So I think if the route is going to be restructuring, the government will have to do more to make sure that it's more transparent in its dealings, in its fiscal management, and that it has made an effort that doesn't seem from the current budget that it's making to create the capacity to repay, and so in order to be able to solidly negotiate a haircut.
Thank you very much. Joe, perhaps some closing thoughts from you on realistically what's next for Mozambique and in this restructuring process.
Well, I think there's an argument to be made that Mozambique shouldn't restructure at all. That I think there's an argument to be made that Mozambique shouldn't pay its private commercial creditors at all. And if you look at the history of debt defaults, countries that default on the debt usually do better than countries that try to repay debt when they get into debt distress. And I think that might at this point make more sense, although it would have short-term problems. I think a flat default on the commercial debt might work better. By the time any settlement got negotiated 5 years from now, you would have gas money that you might be able to use to reach some deal with the creditors.
It's
but
not
I would
going to come in 5 years from now, Joe. It's going to come much, much later than that. Not 5 years from now that the gas money is going to come.
That's
the
probably
gas money is going to come 15 years or 10 years from now. They might start pumping up gas in 5 years or 7 years time from now, but real money for the government of Mozambique is not going to come. It's not going to come in 10 years time.
I think that's a very good point, right? That I think there's a difference between first gas and first royalties, right? Like even the money that goes the money that goes in from the majors and the capex that goes in has to obviously be repaid first before there's royalties, right? So the first sign of royalties is probably, obviously the Lazard and their advisors have speculated that things will really improve and there'll be some payment capacity from 2021, 2022. I think even that is very ambitious. And obviously that will be important to consider as part of any settlement with creditors.
I actually agree with you on that.
I mean, in the end, again, I think there's obviously a payment capacity issue as much as a solvency issue.
I think Tom was going to add something here.
From Mozambique.
Oh, sorry, Tom, I cut you off.
Yeah, can you hear me okay, right?
Yeah, we can now.
No problem. I just wanted to go to the issue of potentially gas warrants as a restructuring solution, Tariq. Could you just explain how that might work and whether or not it could be a reasonable solution in this circumstance?
Yeah, so I think that's something that I've heard floated around by some people close to the IMF, World Bank, etc. Is that you could use or alleviate any haircut that investors would receive with gas warrants. Now that's obviously those are very, very difficult to value, and the timeliness of cash flows is very tough to gauge. But look, it would obviously give investors an ability to sort of participate on the upside of any development of the gas fields. Look, obviously.
So what might a gas warrant look like?
I think you'd obviously. I think there would obviously you'd in terms of getting. I don't want to get too formulaic, but just as you'd receive a certain percentage or a share of some of the gas royalties that are paid, or perhaps a share of ENH or the national energy company's profits, from 2022 onward or so forth.
Okay, so some mechanism to share Mozambique's gas riches when they do finally start coming with
Exactly. Look, I think the other thing to point out is there's been a lot made and a lot of comparisons made to Ivory Coast restructuring in 2011. There, obviously, you had quite a big coupon holiday. I think it was 5 or 6 years off the top of my head, and there was a 25 or a 23-year term out of the bonds. So look, that's obviously another way to alleviate the near-term cash flow pressure on Mozambique and one potential comparable transaction.
Okay, well, this is a story which has clearly a long way still to run. Unlike this webinar, which I think it's probably time to draw to a close now. My name's Tom Bowker, I'm the editor of Zitamar News. I'd like to thank you very much for joining us for this conversation. And particular thanks to the panel, Anne Frühauf, Roberto, Tibana, Joseph Hanlon, and Tariq Hamoodi. This event will be made available, technological hiccups allowing, on zitamar.com or through our SoundCloud channel, and it should also, I hope, remain available to view on YouTube. If you subscribe to Zitamar's newsletter, you'll receive more details on this in Friday's edition. Discussion with the Repercussions Institute. For details on how to get a copy of that, please email him directly at the email address that we put on the slides. It's nick@africaresearchinstitute.org. If you'd like to try Zitamar News, we can offer a free trial subscription to viewers of the webinar. Please email subscriptions@zitamar.com. And in fact, that's on our last slide here. For further updates, follow @Zitamar News and @Africa Research on Twitter. Thanks again to our panel for giving up an hour of your time this afternoon, and thank you to you, the viewers, for watching and for your participation. Thanks very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.